scissors. We've always heard that's dangerous. Is it? Let's find out. Told you from Seattle, two of the richest men in the world live there, Bezos and Gates. Bezos has about 200 billion. Gates has about 160 billion. You know what 200 billion is? That's 1,000,000 times 200,000. 200,000 times 1,000,000. I think any of us would be very excited to see $200,000 sitting right in front of you, right? And if you had $200,000 sitting in front of you and somebody asked for $1, you'd go, well, sure, you can have $1. You can have $1. I'll give everybody in the room $1. I basically still have $200,000, right? That's what $1,000,000 is to those guys. Doesn't mean anything. Do you think they come home after a hard day and go, oh boy, I feel like $1,000,000? But you know what they can never have that we can have? There is a thrill they can never have that we can have. You ever put on an old article of clothing you haven't worn in a while, find a $20 bill in the pocket? Like, oh, there's a 20 in here. You kidding me? 20 bucks. There's also no tip that they can leave that won't anger the wait staff. If I left a $50 bill on a $20 drink tab, that bartender would know my name next time I walked in there. Bezos, Gates, they leave $1,000 on a $20 bar tab. Bartender goes, what a jerk. Could have left me $1,000,000.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, August the 3rd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Maria-Bartiromo, No Free Lunch, The Rape of the Mind, Vivek Ramaswamy, Tucker Carlson, Kari Lake, Donald Trump, and Delta Force. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
The knowledge problem. Dispersed knowledge is essentially dispersed and cannot possibly be gathered together and conveyed to an authority charged with the task of deliberately creating order. F.A. Hayek. While Hayek's contributions to 20th century thought should never be limited to merely one quote, it is perhaps this basic notion of the knowledge problem that defines Hayekian thought at its finest. Building off of the Misesian notion of human action, Hayek here says, essentially, that no central authority could ever gather the knowledge that is dispersed throughout society and individuals adequately enough to maintain order, let alone optimize prosperity. This basic reality of knowledge undermines the entire thesis of statism and should never be forgotten for any who desire a free and prosperous society.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now from Ayn Rand's book called The Virtue of Selfishness. The cult of moral grayness could not succeed by an open rebellion against morality and struggles to elevate the negation of morality into a superior kind of virtue. Observe the form of that doctrine. It is seldom presented as a positive, as an ethical theory or subject of discussion. Predominantly, you hear it as a negative, as a snap objection or reproach, uttered in a manner implying that you are guilty of breaching an absolute so self-evident as to require no discussion. In tones ranging from astonishment to sarcasm to anger to indignation to hysterical hatred, the doctrine is thrown at you in the form of an accusatory, "Surely you don't think in terms of black and white, do you?" Prompted by confusion, helplessness, and fear of the entire subject of morality, you hasten to answer guiltily, "No, of course I don't," without any clear idea of the nature of the accusation. You do not pause to grasp that the accusation is saying, in effect, "Surely you're not so unfair as to discriminate between good and evil, are you?" Or, "Surely you're not so evil as to seek the good, are you?" Or, "Surely you're not so immoral as to believe in morality." Moral guilt, fear of moral judgment, and a plea for blanket forgiveness are so obviously the motive of that catchphrase that a glance at reality would be sufficient to tell you what an ugly confession you are uttering. But escape from reality is both a precondition and the goal of the cult of moral grayness. Philosophically, the cult is a negation of morality, but psychologically, this is not the cultist's goal. What the cultists seek is not a morality, but something more profoundly irrational. A no absolute, fluid, elastic, middle-of-the-road morality. The cultists do not proclaim themselves beyond good and evil. They seek to preserve the advantages of both. The cultists are not moral challengers, nor a medieval version of flamboyant evil worshippers. The cultists advocate not selling your soul to the devil, but renting it out to the highest bidder. And again, that was from Ayn Rand's book called The Virtue of Selfishness. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit of Vivek Ramaswamy.
In this whole idea of the Facebook files showing us the government was actually censoring the truth. Censoring the truth as if we can't handle the truth or as if their truth is the only truth. What do you think about that?
Well, look, I think this is the predominant form of censorship we've seen in the last several years, Trace. The government is using private companies like Facebook to do through the back door what government could not do directly through the front door under the Constitution: censor politically disfavored speech. The reality in this country is that the path to truth, it runs through free speech and open debate. That is why we have a First Amendment. I do not think we would have run into those and rushed into those vaccine mandates as quickly if we had been allowed to debate the facts in the open. So I think this is a good learning. And the problem with our mistakes in our history is if we don't learn from them, we commit far worse in the future. At least let this be a learning that the next time we run into a supposed emergency circumstance, be it a pandemic or anything else, free speech and open debate is the thing we have to protect the most.
And so that was Vivek Ramaswamy on Fox News. And the interviewer asked Mr. Ramaswamy, what do you think about that? And what Mr. Ramaswamy should have said was, it's not about what I think, it's about what is moral or immoral, right or wrong. And in this particular case, it is wrong, and it is wrong because the government has no rights. That's the most powerful thing that he can say. That's the most powerful thing he could have said, should have said. Back in a minute. Thank you. And this is from Maria-Bartiromo.
Your previous segment with Larry and talking about the targeting of President Trump, that's purposeful. Because the previous administration of President Trump was being successful, because President Trump was advancing policies the left doesn't like, they're now targeting him with this political harassment. And anybody who wants to preserve and protect this great country and this republic ought to recognize this sham indictment for what it is. And you ask what we can do. We ought to stop funding this stuff. Stop funding Alejandro Mayorkas and open borders. Stop funding an FBI that is out of control. Stop funding a DOJ that's out of control and targeting a former president. And stop funding the United Nations and UNRWA and all of these ridiculous organizations that are undermining Israel.
Well, why aren't you doing it then?
Well, I am standing up to do that, Maria, and I've been fighting that here in Congress and will continue to do that. The message really is why isn't the entire Republican conference doing that?
Yeah, I'd like to know. That's a good question. We're all talking about the Republicans and why the Republicans can't be on the same page about these things. Americans want some answers. Victoria, you both right that there's a deadly cost to the Biden-Israel policy. What is it?
So, again, hooray for Maria-Bartiromo. Instead of most talk show hosts, radio or television, right-wing talk show hosts are butt lickers. They get anybody with an R after their name, and they just can't wait to kiss their ass. Oh, drop your pants so I can kiss your ass. She doesn't do that. She puts it right to this guy. This is what we should be doing. This is what we should. He talks a good game and all that, and she puts it right to him. Why aren't you doing it? Now, he has a good answer. Chip is one of the better members of Congress, along with Marjorie Taylor Greene and a couple of others that are actually doing something. Marjorie Taylor Greene is one who has actually written articles of impeachment against Joe Biden. Good for her. Bad for the rest of the caucus. Shame on them. And that's where Maria-Bartiromo could have followed up. But good for Maria-Bartiromo for challenging these folks. These are the people that we've got to get straight. We're never going to be able to reach the Democrats. They're lost. They're hopelessly lost. The only people we're going to be able to communicate with is the Republicans. And when they do wrong, they need to know it. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind.
The enigma of coexistence. Is it possible to coexist with a totalitarian system that never ceases to use its psychological artillery? Can a free democracy be strong enough to tolerate the parasitic intrusion of totalitarianism into its rights and freedoms? History tells us that many opposing and clashing ideologies have been able to coexist under a common law that assured tolerance and justice. The church no longer burns, it apostates. Before the opposites of totalitarianism and free democracy can coexist under an umbrella of supervising law and mutual goodwill, a great deal more of mutual understanding and tolerance will have to be built up. The actual Cold War and psychological warfare certainly do not yet help toward this end. To the totalitarian, the word coexistence has a different meaning than it has to us. The totalitarian may use it merely as a catchword or an appeaser. The danger is that the concept of peaceful coexistence may become a disguise, dulling the awareness of inevitable interactions and so profiting the psychologically stronger party. Lenin spoke of the strategic breathing spell, paradaiksha, that has to weaken the enemy. Too enthusiastic a peace movement may mean a superficial appeasement of problems. Such appeal has to be studied and restudied, lest it result in a dangerous letdown of defenses which have to remain mobilized to face a ruthless enemy. Coexistence may mean a suffocating subordination, much like that of prisoners coexisting with their jailers. At its best, it may imitate the intensive symbolic or ever parasitic relationship we can see among animals which need each other, or as we see it in the infant in its years of dependency upon its mother. To those living freely in a democracy, coexistence must imply freedom and mutuality. The totalitarian concept of unfreedom cannot mix with freedom. There are concepts and ideas that cannot coexist and that do not tolerate one another. In order to coexist and to cooperate, one must have notions and comparable images of integration, of a sameness of ideas, of a belonging together, of an interdependence of the whole human race, in spite of the existence of racial and cultural differences. Otherwise, the ideology backed by the greater military strength will strangle the weaker one. Peaceful coexistence presupposes on both sides a high understanding of the problems and complications of simple coexistence, of mutual agreement and limitations, of the diversity of personalities, and especially of the coexistence of contrasting and irreconcilable thoughts and feelings in every individual, of the innate ambivalence of man. It demands an understanding of the rights of both the individual and the collectivity. Using coexistence as a catchword, we may obscure the problems involved, and we may find that we use the word as a flag that covers gradual surrender to the stronger strategist.
And that was The Enigma of Coexistence from The Rape of the Mind by Joost-Meerlo, M.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit more Vivek Ramaswamy.
Nashville now, an event we have been anticipating. This is Vivek Ramaswamy. He's live there in Nashville, and he's there to call on authorities to release the Covenant school shooters manifesto. We're going to dip in here and listen to what he has to say there.
There's a mass shooting. It is a long-standing tradition of law enforcement in the United States of America to, when it is recovered, release the manifesto of the shooter. We have to learn from tragedy to prevent it in the future. The manifesto of the killer was made public in each of the following instances: Allen, Texas; Buffalo, New York; Charleston, South Carolina; Isla Vista, California; Monterey Park, California; Poway, California, in all cases within 48 hours of the tragedy. The public demanded the same happen here in Nashville immediately after the tragedy in March. In fact, the National Police Association has since sued city officials and county officials demanding the same. It turned out that on April 27, Governor Bill Lee, the governor of this state, pledged to release that manifesto. Yet today we're sitting here in August with nothing other than stonewalled silence from our government. That is wrong. That does not build public trust. That erodes public trust. I'm here today to make a demand of the governor of Tennessee, to make a demand of the Nashville Police Department, to make a demand of the FBI. Release the manifesto. Speak the truth. The hard times are the times where we must most openly speak that truth. It is hardest to speak the truth under difficult circumstances, but that is when we require it the most. I understand that there are legitimate concerns, that we do not want details released that will motivate copycats. I don't want that. The fellow Americans who earnestly have called for the release of this manifesto, they don't want that either. And I want to go on record and say it would be perfectly reasonable for the police to redact any sections of this manifesto that lay out specific plans, that lay out specific premeditated plots on details of execution that could be copied by another individual. But what we do need to know is this killer's motives, this killer's psychological state of mind. The truth of the matter is that we have a mental health epidemic in this country that is driving a wave of violence around this country, and we're going to have to deeply understand it if we are to address it. History teaches us that we make our worst policy decisions as a nation when we suppress the truth on the back of a tragedy. Take the tragedy of the COVID-19 pandemic. We would not have shuttered schools in this country if we had been allowed to debate in the open school closures and hear the truth about COVID-19. We would not have mandated COVID vaccines so quickly if we had been allowed
So a really interesting moment there in Nashville, where obviously a GOP candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy, is standing there, where obviously this shooting took place March 27, 2023. The manifesto to which he is referring of the Nashville shooter, Audrey Hale, the parents of Audrey Hale transferred that manifesto to the Covenant School parents. The parents are battling to not have that manifesto released, which is obviously an interesting thing in and of itself, that they're working with the shooter's family to keep that manifesto from going public. Vivek Ramaswamy there is making the case that we need to learn from tragedy to improve the future, that we have to address what is in that manifesto in order to make things better and make things safer in the future. So an interesting stance, Rich, from Vivek Ramaswamy, who has been very vocal on many issues. This is the first time we have heard him speak directly to that.
Yeah, it is, Sandra. Usually around this time, presidential hopefuls are in Iowa and New Hampshire. But he's leading somewhat of an unprecedented presidential campaign here. It's pretty atypical for Vivek Ramaswamy. He's a businessman. He's made issues that go beyond sort of many of the normal political issues, and certainly wanted to make one of it here. And as you mentioned, there is opposition from the families of both the shooter and many of the victims in this case who do not want this release, but there are many legal efforts to try for the opposite.
And that was Vivek Ramaswamy on Fox News. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Tucker Carlson with Devin Archer.
You have said that there were occasions when Joe Biden would call in with clients present on a speakerphone.
Right.
How many times do you think that happened?
I mean, over a 10-year partnership, I would, the number I'm going with is 20. That's probably the amount that I kind of reckon. Yeah, a lot.
Just to keep it to the facts, Joe Biden, then the sitting vice president, knew that there were Hunter's business associates in the room.
Yeah, I think I can definitively say at particular dinners or meetings, he knew there were business associates.
So Mike, that he's, again, the same guy, Devin Archer, but he went a little bit further than the testimony he gave, where he said, oh, yeah, he knew, Biden knew, Joe Biden knew, the big guy knew. What are your thoughts on this latest development?
Well, I think it kind of blows out of the water that assessment that Dan Goldman, the congressman from New York, said, that they just talked about the weather. Because everybody knows if you're in a very high-level business meeting, your dad calls in and you put him on speakerphone and talk about the weather, especially when your dad is the sitting vice president of the United States. Look, it was theatrics. It was all about letting Hunter be able to say, hey, my dad's the vice president, and when I need him to come through for me, by golly, he just dials right in, and I get him on speakerphone. So that's what they were doing. This is influence peddling. They were selling the idea of access to the vice president of the United States. I don't think anybody in his or her right mind would say it was just coincidental that these phone calls kept happening right in the middle of business meetings with Hunter.
Yeah, and let's not forget, Huck, that Hunter was making millions upon millions of dollars working for and sitting on a board of a Ukrainian energy company, and Hunter has absolutely 0.0 experience in energy. For what? Other than, like you said, the phone call, he dials, guess who picks up? Second most powerful man in the world. Oh, hey, what do you know? Phone's ringing. Who's this? Oh, second most powerful man in the world. Burisma needed that prosecutor to go away. That prosecutor was going to investigate Burisma. I'll quote Joe Biden. Well, son of a... It went away, didn't it, for that $1 billion check to the Ukrainians?
Yep. In 6 hours, it went away, and Joe bragged about it. That's the thing that is just stunning to me. He boasted of the fact that he threatened that he would withhold and take back to Washington $1 billion in aid from the United States to Ukraine if Shokin, the prosecutor who had been snooping around Burisma, was going to investigate them for corruption. The very board Hunter was on. If Shokin didn't get fired so that they would leave Burisma alone, $1 billion disappears. And just as you say, guess what happened? Shokin gets fired. Yeah. And Burisma does its business. This smells worse than a whole family of skunks at a Sunday school picnic.
I knew we were going to get a Huckabee in there at one of those points. So there it is. And by the way, folks, don't yell at me for saying that word. I'm quoting the sitting president of the United States when he...
And so that was not only Tucker Carlson, Devin Archer, but then it was then a Newsmax interviewer interviewing Mike Huckabee, former governor of the state of Arkansas. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of Donald Trump.
And we have a corrupt, compromised president, crooked Joe Biden, who is dragging us into World War III. And that's what's happening on behalf of a nation that paid his family millions and millions of dollars in obvious bribes. All you have to do is take a look at how much China, how much Ukraine have paid the Biden family. It's a total disgrace and a very dangerous one. Under these circumstances, the notion that we would even consider admitting Ukraine into NATO at this time is completely unhinged. Joe Biden can't even walk up a flight of stairs on Air Force One, and he can't put two sentences together. The last thing that this incompetent administration should be doing is risking war with a nuclear-armed Russia or China or other countries. We have somebody that doesn't have a clue representing us.
And that was former President Donald Trump. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, inside Delta Force.
Within 4 miles, I was catching and passing some of the runners. I planned to march for 2 hours before I took a breather, and thereafter take a few minutes break every hour. It was full dark now, but the ambient light was pretty good, and the white sand of the road showed all the holes and furrows to be avoided. All in all, a pretty good route. When I was about 7 miles into the march, I saw a cluster of lights up ahead on the side of the road with shadowy figures moving around within. As I got closer, I saw several trucks circled around a group of trees with their lights illuminating some kind of activity. As I approached, a cadre member beckoned me over. I gave him my color and number, and he told me to drop my rucksack under any one of a set of scales that were dangling from a pole tied between 2 trees, and to fill my canteens from the water cans on the back of one of the trucks. I dropped my rucksack, grabbed my canteens, and drained one straight down as I walked over to find the water cans. Without my rucksack, I felt light enough to fly, but that would change in a few more hours. I watched the activity in the circle of light as I took another drink and filled my canteens. When I walked back over to the scales, I saw an interesting exchange between one of the walkers and a man who seemed to be the cadre member in charge of the site. The cadre was saying, "Sarge, your rucksack is light. It doesn't meet the 40-pound requirement." Before he could continue, the walker interrupted, saying, "Well, it's got to be close. How much does it weigh?" "I really can't tell you," the cadre replied in a monotone. "If you look at the scales, you'll see they don't register anything less than 40 pounds. So as far as we're concerned, your rucksack weighs nothing." I looked up at the set of scales above my rucksack, and he was correct. The face was painted a solid white until it reached the 40-pound mark. The cadre continued, "And since you're carrying nothing, the only way you can meet the weight requirement is to take this." He reached behind him and handed the guy a big, ragged piece of concrete that looked like it came from a roadbed that had been dug up. "I weighed this myself," he went on, and certify it as weighing exactly 40 pounds. Now, for you to continue the march, you will sign for this item, strap it to your rucksack, and turn it in at the finish point when you complete the march. Any questions? The walker stood there holding the chunk of concrete against his chest, while a half-smirk, half-incredulous look materialized on his face. I recognized him as one of the loudmouths who had been ready with a comment all day, but he was quiet now. He looked up at the cadre in front of him and asked in a pleading voice, "Marvin, are you serious?" So they knew each other. This was getting better. "Completely," was the reply. The guy thought a few more seconds and then said, "No, I can't do that." Dropping the concrete, he stood with his arms hanging down by his side. "Are you voluntarily withdrawing from the course?" A pause. "Yes, I guess I am." "Take your ruck and get on the back of that truck." The cadre chief indicated a vehicle off to the side of the rest. The guy stood there a beat or two longer, looking like he couldn't believe what had happened. Our eyes met, and he gave a slight shrug of acceptance, then picked up his rucksack and moved away. That little exchange sure got my attention, and the attention of everyone else who witnessed it. I grabbed my rucksack and asked the cadre who had weighed it, "Good to go?" as I put my arms through the straps. "Yep, you can roll," he said as he scribbled something on a clipboard. Then he looked up and said to me as I got the rucksack settled on my back, "Have a good 'un." I was out of the circle of light and back onto the road in a few steps. I was glad to be away from there. That had been some little scene. The cadre chief had never been loud or threatening, and he never spoke in a demeaning or insulting manner, but it had been clear he would neither listen to nor tolerate any bullshit. I liked that style. The seriousness of this was starting to feel genuine. The rest of the march was, well, just a night rucksack march. After 12 miles, I was tired, my feet hurt, my shoulders ached, and I was soaked in sweat. I hit the finish point on King Road at a few minutes under 5 hours of march time. The cadre member logged me in on his clipboard, told me it was only 2 miles back to camp, that there was soup in the mess hall, that new instructions were on the bulletin board, and to have a good 'un. I took my time on the walk back to camp. I dropped my ruck by my cot and went to the mess hall for a canteen cup of soup. There were about a dozen other footsore and tired guys in the mess hall, but every one of them wore a look of contentment. It comes from completing a strenuous task and knowing you've acquitted yourself well. Completing a road march is no huge triumph, but it's one of those many small things in life by which you measure yourself. Also, the soup was pretty darn good. One of the things the Army always does right is soup. It's prepackaged, and the cooks make it in 15-gallon pots, but you can always count on it to be steaming hot, and it's just the ticket when you're footsore and tired, and the sweat you're soaked in is starting to chill. It's a simple thing, but one that makes a difference. I said goodnight to the guys in the mess hall and headed for the shower. It was a little after 0100 hours when I checked the bulletin board. It said, 1000 hours, classroom. I hit my cot, wrapped up in my poncho liner, and slept the sleep of the righteous. 1000 hours, sore feet, stiff leg, back, and shoulder muscles. Seated in the classroom, a closed folder and a couple of sharp pencils on the desk in front of me, and a smiling guy up front giving instructions. "Just a questionnaire about yourself, man," he smiled. "It's not timed. Answer every question and give each question your best answer. If something is unclear or confusing, give it your best guess. If something completely stumps you, I'll be at the back of the room. This is strictly an individual effort, no collaboration. Okay, open your booklets and begin." I opened the cover. Psychological test. This would be just the first of many. Throughout selection, we took these tests over and over again. Each was worded a bit differently than the others. The questions were crafted differently, but they were essentially the same questions. just mixed about and phrased in a different manner every time. We always took the tests when we were tired, but not while we were exhausted. By answering the same questions again and again at seemingly random times, an individual was less likely to be able to sustain duplicity or deception. The same held for testing fatigued men. The person who may be trying to craft a lie has less energy to put into the effort. It becomes easier to tell the truth when you can't remember what you might have said last time. But this was the first test of its kind I had ever taken. Most of the questions seemed to have an obvious point. Do you hear voices? Are you an agent of God? Are people following you? Are you often misunderstood? Do you have thoughts too terrible to speak about? The only ones I really wondered about were the several variations of, is your stool black and tarry? That question was in every exam throughout selection. Years later, during the annual mental evaluation of the unit, I asked the shrink about that question and why it had been asked so often. The answer was straightforward and made a lot of sense. Oh, he said, black and tarry stool is an indication of blood in the digestive system, which could mean ulcers or indicate someone with a drinking problem. Very sensible. An hour later, I finished the questionnaire, closed the folder, and carried the material to the cadre member at the back of the room. Smiley cautioned me not to speak about the test and told me that new instructions were on the bulletin board. I stepped outside and blinked in the bright sunshine. The camp was quiet. A line of men was outside the orderly room for out-processing. Some looked a little sheepish, and some covered up their embarrassment with a display of bravado or unconcern. I checked the bulletin board and saw there was nothing scheduled until PT formation the next morning. The whole rest of the day and night free. I went over to B Barracks to see about a comrade. Joe McAdams was an old-timer from our ranger company who had gone into Special Forces last year. I had not seen him, but I'd heard he was in the selection course. This morning at Chow, Parks told me Joe had been injured on last night's march and was in his cot waiting for his unit to send someone to pick him up. Must have turned an ankle, I figured, as I walked into the hooch and scanned the line of bunks for Mac. "Hey, Haney, down here," he called, and gave a languid wave from a cot midway down the building. "God almighty, Mac, what happened to you?" I asked as I came close enough to see the raw and bloody soles of his propped-up feet. "Pads of my feet stayed in my boots when I took them off after the road march." From toe to heel, the bottoms of his feet were completely devoid of skin. It looked as though some ancient Indian warrior with a perverted sense of humor had scalped his feet instead of his head. That raw, naked flesh must have hurt like hell, exposed to the air. "Yeah, it smarts a mite," he said, reading my mind. "You know what happened? All those old ranger calluses were still on my feet, but they weren't very well anchored anymore. I haven't done any rucksack marching since I got out of phase training, Special Forces qualification training, a year ago. The medic said that during the march last night, I got blisters under the old calluses, and eventually the whole mess just came loose. Now ain't that some shit?" "Yeah, Mac, it is," I said, wincing at the sight of his feet. "Looks like you'll be on your ass for a while." "Reckon so," he replied, taking a drag from the cigarette he had just lit. "Guess I'll get a chance to catch up on my reading now." "I guess you will. Are you squared away? Somebody coming to get you?" "My team medic is coming out with an FLA, field litter ambulance, to pick me up, and the group surgeon is going to meet us at Womack Army Hospital, probably spend a day at the hospital to clean him and treat for infection, and then go on convalescent leave until I can grow some new skin," he said, waggling his feet. "You need anything?" I asked as I got up to leave. "Nah, I'm okay. Medic'll be here soon, and I got plenty of cigarettes, so I'll just take it easy until he gets here." "Okay, partner. You hang in there. And tell any of the old gang you see that I said hello." "Will do, man. You do the same. And come and see me when you finish here." "Sure, Mac. Take care." We shook hands and I left, walking away with the image of those obscenely skinned feet in my mind. I was left wondering again where that line was between hard-ass and dumbass. But I guess that's an individual determination. Mac found it last night, somewhere along those last 18 miles. Joe McAdams immediately went into Army legend as the guy who walked his feet off in Delta Force selection. Everybody knew the myth, but few ever knew the man it happened to. Next morning, we fell in for PT at 0600. I maneuvered a spot on the right end of the front rank that would put me in the front of the formation for the run, because I hate running in the middle of a formation. It's always best to be the lead dog. The scenery's better. As we were coalescing into formation, and before a cadre member came out to take charge, I heard more than the usual laughter from back in the group. I looked back to see what kind of stuff was going on, and saw a guy standing in formation wearing a gorilla mask that covered his entire head. His rank insignia said he was a captain, his shoulder patch said he was in Special Forces, and the mask he wore said he was a nitwit. As the twittering died away, no-nonsense Marvin stepped out of the orderly room to take charge of the formation. "Group, attention," he called. "Stand at ease." Just some light PT to loosen up before we start the day, men. And since my voice is a little hoarse this morning, I'm going to need some help calling cadence. Let's see. Yeah, you, Gorilla Man. Get up here and call cadence for me. Gorilla Man made a move to take off his mask. "No," Marvin snapped. "Leave the mask on. You'll take it off when I tell you to. This is my formation and you'll follow my instructions." We then extended ranks for PT, and Marvin put us through one hell of a pace of calisthenics. Gorilla Man was shouting the cadence and exercising, while Marvin shouted at him. Side straddle hops, the high jumper, squat thrusts, push-ups, turn and bounce. We continued the furious pace until the masked moron finally went to his knees, hyperventilating inside his mask. "Get back in the formation," Marvin told him. "Keep the mask. It suits you. Now, group, attention. Close ranks. March. Chow's on in the mess hall. Take your instructions from the bulletin board. Fall out." As the formation fell out with nervous laughter, I watched Gorilla Man pull the mask off his soaking wet head and blanched face. He walked away looking confused by what had happened. I could not fathom what he had expected. Applause? The bulletin board announced another formation at 0800. Plenty of time to clean up and have breakfast. We fell in at 0800, and from there filed through the warehouse where we each picked up a machine gun ammo canister. Once back in formation, the cadre member in charge had us open and inspect the contents of the emergency canisters we all now had. I opened my can and took out the items it contained and checked them off against the list the cadre was reading out loud. URC-68 emergency signaling radio, BS-17 aircraft signaling panel, signal mirror, red smoke grenade, purple smoke grenade, whistle, waterproof match container with matches, tourniquet, cravat, 2 pressure dressings. When we had checked all the items and repacked them in the canister, a new man appeared and took charge of the formation. He identified himself as Major Odessa, the commander of the selection detachment. He was medium-sized with sandy hair and a close-cropped mustache. His skin was the color of light rust. He had the unassuming appearance of a man who would not be singled out in a crowd. But there was an inner power to him that could be felt from a distance and could be seen in his eyes. Now that the preliminaries are out of the way, and some of the less determined individuals have departed for home, we can get down to business, he announced. For the next several weeks, you will undergo the selection process for acceptance into the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment, Delta. Despite the name, this is not a Special Forces unit. It neither belongs to nor reports to the Special Forces Command. This is a new organization whose sole purpose is to perform counter-terrorist and other special operations as directed by the National Command Authority. This is not a training course. It is a selection course. Those who are accepted will be trained once they are assigned to the unit. Now, some ground rules. They are simple and few. Everything you see, hear, and do during this course is classified. You will keep it to yourself. Everything you will do is an individual effort. That means you will assist no other selection candidate, and you will accept assistance from no one whatsoever. You are all seasoned soldiers and experienced NCOs and officers, so we know that each of you can operate as a member and as a leader of a team. But that isn't our concern. We want to know how you operate as an individual. The vehicle we will use to assess that is cross-country navigation, or as the civilians call it, orienteering. Each day, you will receive the instructions necessary to get you started, and as you go along, you will receive the instructions you need for the next event, much as you have received to this point. You will carry a prescribed load between designated rendezvous points, or, as we call them, RVs. Upon arrival at a new point, you will receive new instructions from the cadre member manning that point. You will have finished the day when a cadre member tells you to take off your rucksack and sit down. We were riveted to the sound and meaning of his voice. No one moved a muscle as he spoke. You will be operating against an unannounced time standard. However, at the start of every day, you will be given an overdue time. If you are not at an RV point at that time, you will move to the nearest road and sit down where you can be seen. The cadre will begin looking for you at the overdue time. If you become lost to the point that you cannot find a road at overdue time, or you become injured and can no longer go on, use your emergency signaling kit. If you have a life or limb-threatening injury, use the radio. If night has arrived and you have not been found, build and maintain a small fire in the largest clearing or open area you can find. We will be searching for you, and you will be found. As you move from RV to RV, you will stay off all roads and trails. We define a road or trail as one currently capable of jeep traffic. If you find that your route is running parallel to a road or trail, you will stay at least 15 meters away. You may walk on a road or trail for the 15 meters approaching or departing an RV. If you become injured or sick and require medical attention, tell the nearest cadre member, "I require medical attention." If for any reason at any time you no longer desire to continue with the selection course, tell any cadre member, "I wish to voluntarily withdraw from the course." No one will question your decision. You will be immediately withdrawn and returned to your parent unit. No course reports will be filed on you and sent back to your parent unit. Neither you nor we will talk about anything that takes place during this course. Is there anything I've said to this point that is unclear? Amazingly, there were no questions from anyone. Then we will begin, continued the Major. Remember, you are competing against an unannounced time standard. You are not competing against one another. You will receive the instructions you need to complete each event. Add nothing to the instructions. Subtract nothing from the instructions. Read nothing into the instructions that is not stated. The cadre will not assist you, and you will not assist one another or accept any outside assistance. This is an individual effort. Willful failure to follow instructions will result in dismissal from the course. Failure to meet selection standards will result in dismissal from the course. Do your utmost at all times, and you may find that to be sufficient. He finished his presentation and then looked us over once more before turning us over to a cadre member and silently departing.
And that was In the Beginning, part of part 5 of In the Beginning from Inside Delta Force by Command Sergeant Major Haney. Back in a minute. Thank you. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all of the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. And until next time, be honest, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.